Welcome to Between Product and Partnerships, a podcast focused on bringing together product, partnership, and engineering leaders to discuss how to build, support, and scale SaaS ecosystems. This podcast is presented by Pandium, an integration platform for building native integrations.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for listening to our podcast, Between Product and Partnerships, where we talk about the challenges and what it takes to build integrations, tech partnerships, and SaaS platforms. Today, we are so excited to have Michael Kowalchik, founder and CEO of MatterBeam, join us. Michael, thank you for joining us, and can you share a little bit about yourself and your background with the audience?
Thank you, Cristina, for having me on. I think what you guys are doing at Pandium is super cool. My background, I'm kind of a little bit of a gray beard. I've been in technology for 25 years plus now, which is scary to say. I've started a bunch of startups. I've been in the research lab of a really big company, EMC, for a while. I've been sort of thinking about and playing with data for a really long time. MatterBeam is my latest startup to really try and take some of these crazy ideas and bring them to market in a unique way.
Awesome. So maybe we could start with the beginning. Like, what problem first piqued your interest in data integration? Because not so many people have loved doing that for 20 plus years.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a continuum. I've done a lot of product work where I sort of started the data thing, because obviously a lot of product work starts with data, like what data are you going to use? What really piqued my interest in the sort of broader data integration challenge was my last startup was acquired in 2014 by Pluralsight out in Utah. And as part of that, I was really I came in and I tried to help them revamp their entire product architecture. And when I came in, there was like this weird splinter in my mind where I would have said Pluralsight was doing everything right. They had a top-notch data team. They had a Hadoop cluster. This is 2015, right? Hadoop cluster. It was strategic. They were really all about it, and nobody was happy. Nobody in the company was happy with data. And, I was sort of attacking this product problem, and I squinted and I was like, I actually think this is the same problem writ large across the entire organization from the integration standpoint. And so I did spend a bunch of time at Pluralsight rethinking how data moves to try and solve these big problems. And it was, I was like, it's a splinter in my mind at Pluralsight. And then I kind of talked to a bunch of people in industry, friends at other startups, and it was like true everywhere. Nobody was happy with their data across the board. And so what's going on there? And so that led me to some of the, bringing some of these ideas of data to try and solve that problem, like the bigger, deeper problem.
Can you share what your startup did and what Pluralsight does, just for the audience?
Yeah. So Pluralsight is pretty big company that's in the sort of education space. They did a lot of online training for primarily technology. And what my startup was actually a machine learning company that I started, co-founded in 2010. And that company was all about using machine learning models, Bayesian models at the time, to model uncertainty and skills content and information content in dynamic questions, sort of crowdsourced questions, dynamic content, and people's skills. And so by running this model against this entire population of both questions and people, we could actually bring these like very statistically significant models of, modern mental trait theory to this machine learning model and actually prove that it worked. So you would be able to, it's kind of like the computer adaptive GMAT, but all dynamic. So you could take questions and it would like measure where you were. Obviously, Pluralsight was interested in that from the testing of their skills level. And so they acquired us for that. And then when I came in, they were like, oh, you did some interesting stuff with how you built. The company was Smarter, was my startup. Some really interesting things you've done here. You're like our fifth acquisition. Would you be willing to come out and help us solve this like data problem with primarily product at first across the entire company? And that's how I got there.
Yeah, and I guess like thinking through that, I feel like that acquisition problem of siloed data, because you've gobbled up a bunch of companies, uh, has been persistent for 2 or 3 decades, right? And it's just getting more and more acute as companies are buying more and more smaller like point solutions. Um, why do you think they asked you to help with this? I mean, I'm just being very honest. Like, you're
Y-
coming in,
y-
there's other founders, I'm sure, that were there from acquisitions, but they were like,
Yeah.
you, sir, come in here and make this happen.
Yeah. So, I mean, I hinted at this, but I've been thinking about these ways of thinking about data for a long time. So even how I built Smarter at the time was very built on these ideas of immutable data structures, log structured data. I could take the same, we had multiple views of the same product that we could run in parallel. We ran multiple versions of our models all at the same time by being able to replay these immutable logs. And it was this kind of a spin on microservices, kind of, but like we had this ability to take the same data and rematerialize it in lots of these different ways inside the company, inside of Smarter. And so as we were doing due diligence, the executive team was kind of like, hey, if you could bring this same idea of integrating these disparate systems, disparate stacks, in a way so that the product could become this sort of just more cohesive thing, like we're very interested in that because we're on fire right now. Nothing talks to anything else. You've got to log in on 3 different sites. It's like a big mess. And as you know, there's like 2 ways to do this. One is every acquisition now has to rebuild their entire infrastructure in
Hmm.
our infrastructure to make it work. And what appealed to them was, well, this was an approach to say, well, we could actually make this cohesive fabric of data behind the scenes and still let everyone build the way they build. And so that's what got them excited about it.
It's so common. I'm like actually very surprised at how prevalent that issue is of like this acquisition and these companies operating as sometimes completely independent of one another. Like, it's all under the same parent company, and one as a user would expect that these things talk to each other. But to your point, it's a huge lift to either totally replatform or try to figure out how to keep all of this data in sync. And I think based on chats you and I have had in the past, that is what brought to mind what MatterBeam now does today. So I'm curious, like, how did you attack this problem then? And how did that feed into what you guys are doing now?
Yeah, and it was a little bit of a journey too, because when I first came into Pluralsight, and I had a stellar architecture team, I was kind of in charge of architecture. I was in charge of, how to build this thing, and it started off with kind of a message bus approach, right? Being able to take the same data that was flowing from different, you know, islands in the company and be able to resubscribe to them in different ways. And I actually just posted about this on our blog at one point, or it might have been on LinkedIn, where again, the stellar data team, at one point someone was like, well, we need this data, can we just subscribe to everything because it was an ephemeral bus? And I was like, actually, this is a really good question. Why can't we just have every data challenge just subscribe to this kind of data view? And if you could do that easily, right, if you can make it where it's just a tap that you could pull off of, it starts to solve all these deep ingrained problems. So it started off as a very like product architecture attack approach, and then it morphed into this much deeper sort of project. And the project morphed. The name was actually the Data Vascular System at Pluralsight, which gives you some sense of where it was going. Is this sort of connective tissue across the entire company?
Yeah, we refer to some of the stuff we do as connective tissue, but I think I mentioned before when Pandium was first starting, we thought about a little bit about the problem that you guys are solving, and we called it the hairball, which is a
Yeah,
much less elegant sounding name than MatterBeam or the vascular system.
but it
Um,
is evocative because it is a hairball.
I mean, it can be. We're trying to minimize the hairballs, but that is sometimes what it feels like. Um, how I gotta ask, how long did it take you to kind of get something off the ground at Pluralsight? Like, was this like a years long project, or how did you break that down?
Yeah, it was actually multiple years. So the first part of it, which was integrating the product piece, that we actually got working, within a year, and that was, you did it iteratively, so we could get the value of pieces of it, more quickly. The broader kind of data connective tissue thing was about a 3-year project that really, we built a lot of custom software, a lot of custom, clustered software. We had to operationalize a bunch of systems. It was a challenge. And on top of that, doing data in this way is not how it's done today. And so there was a lot of like, I had the sort of mandate from the executive team, but there was a lot of pushback, right? Oh, this isn't, you're wasting storage. This isn't how you do it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I had to win a lot of hearts and minds, and this is as Pluralsight is growing through, there was a $2 billion IPO as I'm doing this, right? So there's a lot going on at the time.
Can you maybe share more about the sort of legacy way versus your way? I think for folks that are not like deeply in the space, it might not be as clear like how it's done or how it's historically done. What does that mean?
Yeah. A lot of how data is done today is, I sometimes call it the villain is the pipeline. The challenge people think they're trying to solve is we need to get all of our data into the warehouse or all of our data into the lake, or at the time of Pluralsight, all the data into the Hadoop cluster, right? The data lake. Um, and there's this appealing notion that once you get it all in that one place, you're going to have the answers. It'll be solved. You'll be able to query that data, et cetera. And what we were doing was saying, well, rather than try and and part of it is you usually have a use case baked in, right? For the lake and the warehouse, it's usually BI. It's like the dashboards for the executive team or whatever. What I saw happen at Pluralsight, and I've since corroborated this across a lot of other companies, is that the demand for using data for people to do their jobs far outstrips this BI use case. And so there's just incredible frustration everywhere where I want to use it for this product initiative, for this ML pipeline, for this whatever. And it's like, that's a 6-month effort, or it goes into the backlog and you never get it. So that tends to be how it's done today. And what we were doing is saying, rather than build all of these point-to-point bespoke pipelines for each use case, what if we turned it into a utility? What if we made it, instead of building an aqueduct for every use case, you literally had the water utility where you had common fittings and you could tie and you can open the tap and get the data when you needed it. So
Yeah, and I know that like the concept of a message bus has been around for a really long time. But it does seem like it's had a little bit of a resurgence, at least, we're in our neck of the woods with external facing kind of data integration with webhooks and things of that nature. This idea that like you can subscribe to changes versus just pumping everything and then querying with what you need. So it sounds like that was definitely the beginning of MatterBeam. Why did you decide to do this again? It sounds like you've had a couple of companies and you were like, I'm going to be the one to turn this into a product. Like what happened?
so once I had this lens on things, and actually, once we started to deploy this thing at Pluralsight, I saw this transformative thing happen, right? Where, at one point, a story I tell often is this data scientist, like, she literally almost tackled me in the hall. She's like, "Did you build this thing?" And I was like, "Yeah." And she's like, "This got me data in 30 minutes. I've struggled to get for 3 months." Right. I started to see more and more of this transformative thing happening, products launching in 15 minutes instead of 4 weeks, right? Stuff like that. And so it just makes so much sense. And when you get this lens, you see all of these problems that are happening in data and people complain about, and you think like, hey, I think just by shifting your mindset, going with this different pattern, you can solve huge problems that we've had for decades, right? So I have this issue. Then I left Pluralsight and I'm like, all right, somebody's going to build this. It makes too much sense. It's going to happen. And time passed. The pandemic happened. A few other things happened. But then it was kind of like the signals kept coming back to me from the universe. Like, my wife was the CMO at a fast growing startup. And at dinner, she's telling me how she wanted user analytics to feed into her marketing funnel. And they told her no. And it took them a year to get her data, right? Like, those things started to happen. Friends of mine at other companies started talking about it again. And then sort of data mesh happened as well. And I was like, oh, I
The
think
mesh.
she's got it. She's got the key of the problem. And there was such an like industry motion, like, yes, everyone agreed. Everyone has this splinter in their mind. Something is fundamentally broken. This must be it. But there was a lack of practical implementation in there. And so I had a bunch of people from Pluralsight, like, emailing me like, oh, have you seen this data mesh thing? You did it. You built this thing. And I was like, well, it's not exactly data mesh, but I get what you're getting at. And so I was like,
Yeah.
okay, if no one's going to build it, if this isn't going to happen, data mesh, I have to do it. I have to build it.
Oh man, I forgot about the meshes. The meshes really had a moment. There was a mesh for everything for a little bit there.
Yeah.
How is MatterBeam different from a data mesh?
So there's a bunch of different, well, I think Degani, who wrote the original paper on the post on data mesh, I think she did a really good job of identifying the problems with centralization, with the fact that the way we build pipelines is kind of orthogonal to the way actually companies operate. Like, she did a really good job of identifying all those things. when it came time to like, well, what do you do different?
Mm-hmm.
She's like, well, you decentralize everything and teams own data products. And that was kind of it. And so then everyone was like, well, I don't get it. How do you do that? And so then every company said their mesh because they're like, oh, we could do that, but not really.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what's different for MatterBeam is that we started from a practical solution rather than a purely theoretical one, right? And I like to say that instead of being purely decentralized, like Mesh advocates, like these sort of Kubernetes-like pods that do all this stuff, all complete, we are kind of a central network switch kind of model, this hub and spoke idea. So we're centralized from that standpoint, but the data utility is decentralized. So we're logically decentralized. So the data can go anywhere and be used for anything. But by having sort of a central place that can do governance and controls and things like that, it's just a practical solution to that kind of fan out utility model, right?
Man, I'm gonna be thinking about meshes now. I'm gonna have to go back. I feel like
Sorry.
no, when we were first like kicking around the idea in like 2018, 2019, I feel like meshes were like becoming a hot thing, and you don't really see it as much. I know it's just like a term for a concept, but I don't see it quoted quite as often um, on all the socials, the internets. I am curious with the sort of emergence of all of this AI and agents and ML. I think there's a lot of interesting conversations going on about whether or not agents have a place with some of this data hygiene. And I'm not, there's a lot of different thoughts about whether or not that is appropriate, but I'm curious kind of generally, especially since you've been in ML for a long time, like
Yeah.
before ML was something that like everybody knew
Yeah.
about and was kind of trying to use.
Yeah. I think, so my position on this, obviously I have some strong opinions about this sort of AI will do everything.
Hit me.
I think, well, I think one of the things is we've struggled. If you really take an honest look at data, how we integrate data, it has not worked for people for decades, right? It hasn't been able to be used. Like no company has really succeeded at being data driven, or very few. There's all those statistics that like 80% of data initiatives fail. All this stuff, it doesn't work for people. And yet there's this kind of magical thinking that if we throw an agent in there, it's going to work for the agent. And I'm like, if it doesn't work for people, how is it going to work for the agent? Right? I don't see how, I mean, unless we get AGI, which all bets are off, but like,
That's another podcast.
that's a whole nother podcast. But like with the realities of where they are today, like, you can't magically sprinkle on like AI and have it work, right? You have to have some foundation. And this is something that I witnessed. Like you mentioned, being in this for a while. Like I was at Pluralsight working on this data stuff when the big ML push in like what it was 2015, 16. And Pluralsight went all in on it, and they hired tons of data scientists, really stellar people, really great teams. And when the rubber hit the road, they couldn't do their jobs. They spent
Mhm.
like that data scientist, like months trying to wrangle data, get data, use data. It's not magic dust. You've got to have something for it to work with. So I think that's my position on a lot of this AI stuff, that there's a lot of hand waving of the agent will just magically make your data clean and it will have
Mhm.
access somehow. And I'm like, well, again, if it doesn't work for people, how's it going to work for the agents?
Yeah, I mean, I have strong opinions in a similar way around like data hygiene and data silos and things of that nature. Like, even in the best case scenarios, if you're working with like two modern cloud based systems and the data's pretty good, there's still like munging that needs to take place to make those things cohesive. And computers, like rule-based systems, are not great at dealing with like user-defined data all the time. So like, you can tell it all day long that like skew goes to skew, but if someone uses a different language, it's in Spanish or something, like those are really obvious but very real opportunities for that stuff to get messed up. And my a concern that I have about trying to insert like agents and LLMs and stuff into that process is that they have an artificial confidence and are not great necessarily at articulating when they're not right. And that data, to your point, is like the food that is feeding these agents, right? So like that foundation needs to be correct for you to get anything right upstream, right?
Right.
So I don't know. I think to your point, there's a lot of hand waving around this idea. Like, sure, ChatGPT is like reading the open internet, and the open internet is obviously filled with garbage, but it is accessible, right? There's a whole universe of data that is underneath like the consumer facing internet. And I'm not sure if we can trust agents to make sense of that right now.
Yeah, and there's a lot of obviously room for what's the word I'm looking for? Wiggle room, right? With the way the LLMs interpret things. Again, we get hallucinations, we get all this crazy stuff. Whereas I'm sure you've seen this too. Like I've been in companies where some subtle change or some subtle thing happened and 3 months passed and nobody noticed. And then there's some critical thing that needed to be done. And it's like that data was gone or it's just wrong or it was broken or like, and that's with really stellar data engineers. That stuff happens all the time. So with something that's like successful 80% of the time, if we're being generous, like, I don't know, that sounds dangerous to me as well.
Yeah, there's also the idea that like these models are creative, right? Like that's kind of why I think people find so much novelty in AI is because it's creative. It doesn't seem like it's just giving you like an if then like any other kind of program. But if the inputs are incorrect, that creativity is like not only is it not useful, but it's kind of dangerous,
Right,
you
right. It's
know?
destructive.
Yeah, not like,
Yeah.
destroy the world Skynet style, but
Right,
more
right. But
like, hey, I'm running a report about my inventory and it is telling me very confidently that it's this number and that's not correct. And it can be really hard to figure that out when it's coming out of a black box versus coming out of Excel as an
right.
example.
Well,
And I hate Excels, but
but that's the other challenge too, right? Is because it's a stochastic process, right? It's a thing that you give it the same inputs and you might get different outputs, right? And so how do you trace what happened back, right? These numbers are off. Maybe it built a stable artifact of some kind, but there's no way to rebuild that art. I mean, it's just there's all sorts of challenges on that.
yeah, I do not disagree. And the being able to trace it back and do some of that replaying is super important. I was just reading something the other day, or maybe it was an ad on a podcast or something that it was saying, like commercially safe AI that you can do replays with for something. Maybe it was like Adobe or something. And I was like, oh, we're adding commercially safe as a phrase now too. Like that's
Yeah,
a
yeah,
little
I
bit
know.
frightening. Like, and I get actually what they're trying to say, but I'm like, do you know that that's commercially safe? Can you guarantee that? Like, and I'm not picking on Adobe. Don't come at me, but um, it's just wild to like
Yeah.
be seeing
I,
all of this stuff.
I mean, that's kind of one of the things that we've seen an uptick on, right? So we set out to build a system that kind of solves this data problems for humans. And I think it is such a core problem for the agents, right? That we're starting to talk about MatterBeam is the data layer for AI because you can do things like use that centralization governance layer to create safe
Hmm.
views of data, things that have been, modeled for that particular use case. And then the agent can actually take that and materialize it into different queryable forms if it needs to, right? And so there's a lot of really interesting acceleration that can happen when the agent can get the data it needs, when it needs, in the shape it needs,
Yeah.
and you can actually trace what that data is and replay it to recreate the same end state, right? So that's where we're seeing a lot of like uptick right now.
Yeah, well, and also like having it all, to your point, in one place in the format that it expects behind sort of your four walls helps with the latency problem that can
Mm.
happen with agents, which I do think is also a real thing. And we've been seeing some stuff coming out recently about folks talking about how to like they're not using the word latency because I think it's kind of a dirty word, but use less tokens by not going to every system directly to grab things ad hoc. And I'm like, yeah, this is the problem. This is a data integration problem yet again
Mhm.
in just a new format, right?
Yeah, yeah, and this gets back again to sort of those core principles that we built the company on, which is we we tend to put everything into one system, like say a BI warehouse or an analytics system or Spark or whatever. And if you need to read that in a different way, it's possible, but it's not efficient for that for a lot of use cases, right? And so you're just going to burn tokens because you're using not the right system for the right use case.
And how would you advise companies to think about like data quality and data consistency? Like, obviously, there's like huge companies that are going IPO, like Pluralsight, but a lot of our listeners are in that like mid market, maybe just starting to think about this conversation. Their executive team is probably saying to use AI to do something to make the data better. Um, yeah, what general kind of ideas or advice would you give folks?
Like specifically on data quality or
Yeah,
just,
data
uh,
quality and
yeah.
consistency, perhaps.
Yeah, so I have again some opinions about data quality, which is I think it's a little bit of a misnomer. I think, or at least the way it's applied in a lot of companies, which is we need the one universal model, we need the one answer, we need the one source of truth, we need the one thing, and that's not how companies operate, right? There's a really somewhat dry book, but Domain Driven Design by Eric Evans, which was kind of a big thing in enterprise software, which is don't try to make the one domain, make your systems map to the domains that exist within the organization, right? And so I think what you want to do is embrace that idea, right? And then what you can do, in the domain driven design is you want to take those individual domains and then translate them for use for what your actual purpose is. So an example might be like, what is a customer? And the constant push is like, well, we need the one customer thing. Well, the way shipping thinks of customer, the way, maybe a physical store thinks of customer, the way the website thinks of customer are actually all different. And so what you want to do is come at it from the other direction and say, hey, executive team, you want to have a single customer statement. You come up with a definition, and then we will transform these three or
Hmm.
four into that shape to do that, rather than go the other way and force everyone into the same box, which never works. Um, so once you do that, and especially if you can make those transformations transparent, right, so that you can actually see what's happening, that builds trust, I think, right? We know it's this, and we know it has these inputs to turn it into this shape. I think you kind of fall off the track often when you try to make the one view, and then as the business changes and things evolve and the reality of reality creeps in, those things start to change in each of those domains, right? And you don't have any way to track that up, right? And so that causes all of these like shadow copies and different versions of customer and all these things to happen, instead of actually embracing that and saying those things will happen. Let's put in a process to make sure that we have a system that produces the right output.
This is how you end up with a Salesforce object with 450 custom fields.
That's exactly what happens. I was joking with one guy who was in the medical field, and he's like, "Yeah, we came up with one model, and each one of our objects has 1,500 fields, and they only fill like about 30 for each use case because it's all the domains are actually represented in one big flat object."
Oh man, this also like thinking about that reminds me of like smart SKUs too, where like you're going to make up SKUs for items, but we're actually going to make it so that every number or digit is a code. And if they're in this specific order, it means like this specific thing. It's just, yeah, it's like attempting to fill a need that it wasn't built for, which is sort
Yeah.
of a little bit on that same riff. I was talking to somebody about ERP stuff on Friday, and I've had like a weekend of PTSD thinking about trying to translate, 100,000 smart SKUs into words. Nightmare fuel. Well, on that note, I think we are coming up on time. This has been really fun. Where can listeners learn more about you and about MatterBeam?
Yeah, obviously matterbeam.com. But we're actually having a webinar coming up soon that's really talking about migrations. So ideas on how to migrate without pain, to do it much more quickly. And so if you go to matterbeam.com/webinar, you can sign up for that.
Oh, that sounds fun. Said nobody ever but us. But people
But us.
listening to this might think it's fun. They're tuning in to learn about data integration. So there's something for everybody out there on the internet. Well, this has been super fun. Any kind of parting final words? Anything else you want to plug?
Um, I mean, I think open your mind that there are different ways to do this data integration stuff. I mean, I think there's probably 40 years of conceptual inertia that, you know, we build the way it's always been built before. And I think if you just make some subtle tweaks and you think about it in a slightly different way, it solves huge problems.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for joining us. This has been
Well,
really
thank you
fun.
for having me. This has been super fun. So
Well, thank you, listeners. If you're interested in learning more about integrations, listening to more podcasts, we got worksheets, we got blogs, you can go to pandium.com. Michael, thanks again. I'm sure folks will be attending your webinar. This is like the perfect audience for it, if there ever was one. And I'm sure we will see you out there and on LinkedIn. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed our content, subscribe to our channel and give us a thumbs up. For more content on tech partnerships, integrations, and APIs, check out our articles, ebooks, and other resources in the description or visit Pandium's website.